All right, folks, good afternoon. Thank you to everybody for taking the opportunity to jump on, and happy holidays to everybody. My name is Jeff Yeagley with Compass IT Compliance, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, where we're going to talk about the PCI DSS version 3.2 requirements that are taking effect at the end of January, what those mean for your organization, and how you can start to best prepare for those requirements. A couple housekeeping things before we go ahead and get started, and I turn this presentation over to our two presenters today from Compass. Number one is I've muted everybody's line to eliminate or reduce the possibility of any background noise. So we're going to have some time at the end for a Q&A session, so if you do have any questions, in the lower left-hand corner there is a chat function where you can go ahead and pop those questions right into there, and then we can answer them at the end. If we have too many questions, since this is scheduled for about 30 minutes, we can go ahead and follow up with you afterwards to make sure that you get the answers to the questions that you have or that you're looking for. The second thing is we will be making a copy of this presentation available. I'll be sending it out to everybody later today, and it will be posted on our website. So feel free to grab that either off of our site, or again, I will be emailing it out. Third, we are recording the webinar, and we will be posting that out to both our website and our company YouTube channel. So when I send that presentation out to you folks today, I will include a link in there to our YouTube channel, so in case you want to forward this on to someone that you might work with, or if you want to review it and answer any questions that you might have, go through it a second time, feel free to do that. And of course, if you have any questions, you can definitely go ahead and reach out to us directly. So I think those are the big housekeeping things. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters today. Again, we're going to be talking a lot about the PCI requirements in PCI DSS version 3.2 that take effect at the end of January. There's some pretty significant changes for both merchants and service providers. So with that, and the reason for doing this, especially so close to the holidays, is that we want to help you get prepared and understand what those expectations and requirements are. So we have two of our qualified security assessors on the line today. We have Jerry Hughes, who is our VP of Operations and one of our senior executive IT auditors, as well as a qualified security assessor. Jerry he was an early adopter of PCI all the way back in 2007 and handles a good portion of the different PCI risk assessments and reports on compliance that we do as an organization. Co-presenting with Jerry today is Derek Boczenowski from Compass. He's our VP of IT Audit. He's also a qualified security assessor through the PCI Security Standards Council, and both these guys are certified information systems auditors as well and have extensive experience doing not just PCI risk assessments and audits, but audits through various different vertical markets, including financial services, etc. So they both bring some excellent and a breadth of experience across the information security world. So without further ado, I'm going to transition this over and allow Derek and Jerry to go ahead and present on today's topic. Go ahead, guys, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and folks, thanks for your time today. This is Jerry Hughes. Jeff gave us a great introduction already. I just wanted to say good afternoon.
And this is Derek Boczenowski. So today we're going to be talking about, as Jeff said, thank you, Jeff, talking about the PCI requirements for January in 2018. Many of you know PCI 3.2 came out a little while ago, and a lot of these were marked as best practices coming up until February 1st of 2018. So at the end of January, these best practices become live. So it's a fairly quick webinar, so let's jump right into the slides. As Jeff likes to say, a little bit of housekeeping. Today we're going to talk about timelines and deadlines. We're going to go through each of the big changes of the ones that are effective and discuss the changes, and then time permitting, we'll have a little question and answer session as well.
Okay, so we'd like to jump in first with the deadline, which is fast approaching. We are in the middle of a 3-year cycle when PCI, the data security standard, is refreshed. So these items, as Derek had mentioned, were best practices until February 1, 2018. So that being said, we're going to cover the items here, the requirements for the changes in the report on compliance audit, and these need to be in place as as is required with all the control objectives that are listed in there. A failure for any one of these control objectives, including the new ones, obviously results in a fail to the report on compliance audit overall. So these same items, several of these will also be in the appropriate self-assessment questionnaires. There's a number of those. We have a webinar that we've done on those different ones that you can refer to in our library should you have questions. Most organizations should have started this process already, but we thought, you know what, it's near the holidays, the end of the year is coming up quickly, but we thought we'd carve out a little time, try to make this more of a workshop webinar, so you can ask pointed questions at the end. Many of the controls and requirements are for service providers, but you know, there are a few that are also directly required by merchants.
So in this, for this webinar, we're really just going to launch right into the controls. Most of you are familiar with PCI and a lot of the things that revolve around it. Rather than give an intro of what it is and how it works, we're just going to talk about the new controls that need to be implemented. So the first requirement is out of requirement area 3.5.1. This is a control, as you'll see in the following slides, we've marked requirements that are for service providers only. We'll have a little red tag in one of the bullets. If the requirement is applicable to everybody, both merchants and service providers, you'll see a little blue tag. In a nutshell, this requirement is make sure that people are maintaining a documented description of the cryptographic architecture. And now you've already had the responsibility to have cryptographic policy and procedure and things of that. This is actually a process. So what we're really looking for in this case is that if we come in, we'd like to see, you know, what you're using, how you're using it, and have it described, basically, almost a write-up, the descriptions, what you have in place, what sort of hardware. HSM and SCDs are basically hardware and software management tools that you're using if you happen to be using them. A lot of people use spreadsheets, a lot of people use Word docs and paper. It doesn't designate that you have to use a certain methodology for the architecture or how you're going to store or how you're going to keep, but there has to be one. And in this case, basically what they're saying is it has to be written out, not just there's a policy that you will do it. We want to see what the description is and how you're planning, you know, how you're planning on using and protecting these keys.
So the next control is in section 6, the change. Section 6, for those of you who aren't completely familiar, that deals with the development of software and or acquisition of software. But this change 6.4.4 requires that upon the completion of a significant change, all relevant PCI data security standard requirements must be implemented on all new or changed systems and networks, and documentation updated as applicable. So there's requirements for all parties, that's merchants, service providers, and then some entities that are both a merchant and a service provider. So for large networks or system changes, make sure that no PCI controls are broken as part of the system change. Now this was always implied, and I guess there was apparently issues with organizations in the full understanding, so they made it a firm requirement now starting on February 1.
So in addition, you know, make sure as part of the requirement that the changes are documented. What kind of, you know, many of you already have change management process in place, and the changes should be documented. This is ensuring it is, demonstrating any changes made as part of the system change. Any policy you have to change, any procedure you have to change that affects the PCI environment or the cardholder data environment. The goal of this is to make sure that the changes don't introduce new issues into the into the mix. So the next requirement is 8.3.1, and this requirement is also for everyone, and it tends to be probably the highest profile requirement that I can think of out there, and it's the requirement for multi-factor authentication. They've split this requirement into several different areas. 8.3.1 is the new part of the requirement, and it's basically says that, well, let me take a step back. Previously, anybody from the outside, any third-party vendor, or if you were working from home, anything else like that, you were required to have multi-factor authentication to remote into the CDE and do work. That's still in place. That hasn't changed. Now the requirement is, even within your organization, if you happen to be sitting in the IT shop and you need to remote in to the CDE, the requirement is non-console access into the CDE requires multi-factor authentication. So if you have a segmented network, for example, you must use multi-factor to access the resources if you have administrative access. We get a lot of questions on this, quite a bit, and many of them revolve around, well, I have one set of usernames and passwords to get into the network, I have another set of usernames and passwords to get into the CDE. That does not qualify as multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is something you know, like a username or password, something you have, like a token or a certificate, and something you are, like a biometric, like a fingerprint or an iris scan or something else like that. Multi-factor authentication means you have to have at least two of those, of those in place. So dual sets of passwords will not work as multi-factor.
Thank you, Derek. So one of the new controls in the section 10, which is really for the focus on centralized, the log server requirements for centralized log serving and the interrogation of audit logs. The requirement is to implement a process for the timely detection and reporting of failures of critical security control systems, including but not limited to the failure of your firewalls, your IDS, IPS, file integrity monitoring, antivirus, physical access controls, logical access controls, audit logging mechanisms, and segmentation controls if used. So this requirement is for service providers only. You know, there's a few things worth pointing out here, though, too. I think it's critical. In version 3.0 and before, you know, the cardholder data environment or the necessity to have to perform a PCI, either report on compliance, audit, or self-assessment questionnaire, they defined the CDE previously as just where you store, transmit, or process payment card information, and anything connected to it, meaning if I've got a server that's in the same network segment that passes payment card information, but there's other devices in there that aren't PCI, but if they're in the same segment, they're connected to it, so those were in scope. In release 3.0 and 3.1 and now 3.2, the requirement was extended, or the definition of what the CDE is and what's required for being required to be audited as part of the scope of PCI, and that is they've added the security of the CDE. So, for example, where we define the CDE, where your servers are that may store, transmit, or process, now they're saying also items like your intrusion detection system and intrusion prevention systems that are part of the security of that CDE. Also, your antivirus software, your file integrity monitoring, all those kinds of controls that are in place, those are responsible for the controls of and the protection of that CDE. So those are in scope now, where previously they were not directly. The other thing too, continued sort of on the requirement 10.8, you need to consider how does your organization detect and report critical network and application failures. So what they're looking for here is not just to make sure that you have these in place, but now that as auditors, myself and Derek, when we go on site to assess an organization, we're going to be looking for not only that you have detected issues, that you are now reporting on those and also documenting those. So we'll be looking for evidence of that as well. You need to be able to document issues in logs, alerts, and things of that nature, and write up incidents as they occur. Make sure that your audit and your logging policies and procedures also align with this new change. It's paramount that these are all in unison together.
Thanks, Jerry. So this is a very busy slide. 10.8 and 10.8.1 kind of go hand in hand. I'm not going to read the massive amount of detail on the second bullet. The first bullet is important, though, to respond to failures of any critical security controls in a timely manner and have processes for responding to those failures in the security controls and what they must include. So many of you who have gone through these PCI assessments these are fairly normal questions that we would ask. But a lot of them come out of Section 12 when we take a look at incident response. And taking a look at the next slide just as a prompt. This is another one for service providers only. But in responding to failures of any critical security controls in a timely manner, if you replace the word controls with events, responding to failures of any critical events in a timely manner, well, that's your incident response policy. And so, do you have a strong incident response policy? Has it been tested? Does it take all of 10.8.1 into account? So I'm going to go back to the last slide for a second and take a look at all the things that we have here. And if we take a look at them, does your incident response plan, can you use your incident response plan to, restoration of security functions, root cause, implementing controls, performing risk assessments, things of that nature? If you can, that's great. There's no reason that you can't leverage this to be able to have this requirement in place and say, hey, here's our incident response policy. It'll be able to take care of antivirus or any sort of security control monitoring and issues that we have. If you can't, if there's a gap, you may need an additional set of procedures and process to be able to deal with this issue. But the big thing is, being able to report out on, an antivirus outage or a firewall outage or an IPS IDS outage. These are all things as service providers you probably already have anyway. You may not have documented them formally, but more than likely you already have them in place.
That's Derek. But Jerry.
Hey folks, if you guys could just mute your line, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. We can hear you on the conference. Okay, so moving on to the next new control, the requirements in Section 11. And Section 11, for you folks that are not familiar, really is your vulnerability assessments and your penetration tests, a lot of the scanning of the infrastructure. So in this requirement 11.3.4.1, it's required. This is a big one too. When you look at the scope of the changes and the requirements as it impacts your business, this is a big one. So if segmentation is used, and by the way, it's highly recommended that you do use segmentation to minimize not only the scope of an audit or of the self-assessment questionnaire, but to minimize the risk to your business, and it does also reduce the cost. So it really is a win-win. But if you're using segmentation, you need to confirm that the payment card industry data security standard scope, that you've segmented properly. And the way you do that is through penetration testing, an internal penetration test, where you're testing the boundaries of that segmentation, both inside and out. And once you've validated that, then you have indeed successfully reduced your scope. The big change here is, number one, it's for service providers only, and number two, it's now, because of the criticality of it, they've said, instead of doing it once a year, which was the previous requirement, they now want it done semi-annually. So twice a year, you need to be getting your penetration tests performed by a qualified party. And also, the goal here is to ensure that changes in the environment do not inadvertently cause a gap in segmentation. And historical data, that is to say, where the PCI data security standard has demonstrated to come up short over the years, changes are implemented in each revision of the data security standard. And this is a case where they found that improperly segmented networks has resulted in risks and threats unnecessarily. So they've required now we do it twice a year. It's an excellent move, highly recommended. It's going to cost though, so be prepared.
Yeah, the big point, another big point where this is concerned as well is that with an annual test, more and more often, especially service providers, make a lot of changes to their networks constantly. And without that retest, if you make a fairly sizable network change 2 months down the road and it gives a huge segmentation gap at that point, you're not going to know about it for potentially the better part of a year.
And one other note too here, so it always was a requirement, if you made a change to your network, that you had to revalidate that you were in concert still with PCI and what's required. Because organizations fail though to do that, they've mandated this now starting February 1, that indeed you have a penetration test internally performed semi-annually.
So now we're up to section 12, the last section on the PCI 1 through 12 hit list. Requirement 12.4.1. So now we get into some of the governance and housekeeping items. Section 12 deals with a lot of policy, procedure, process, and governance. This is another requirement for service providers only, and the control states that executive management shall establish responsibility for the protection of cardholder data and a PCI DSS compliance program. Now, what does this mean? Really, what we find when we go into a lot of organizations is PCI is the responsibility of IT because it's technical and there's data flowing back and forth and it's on servers. We might have a little bit in the finance department. We might have a little bit in operations. But if you went in and asked who's responsible for PCI in your organization, very, very few people have actually, or a few companies, I should say, have a group of people or a single person that says, this is the person who's responsible for it. PCI Council is now mandating that that be established, including, which is a best practice for governance in general, defining a charter for the compliance program, communications to executive management, and the goal being to assign overall accountability to a person or group of people for maintaining PCI compliance. Because let's face it, everybody has day-to-day jobs that can get away from them very, very easily. If someone isn't tasked with doing this, it's very easy for it to fall by the wayside. So the goal is to establish owners for the PCI compliance and define roles and responsibilities. If you have more than one person that's responsible, you could have 3 or 4 people on the PCI compliance program or PCI committee, for lack of a better term. You could have that IT person that's responsible for this. You could have somebody who's only responsible for vendor management. You could have an executive sponsor who ultimately is going to be signing off on the SAQ reports. They go off back and forth. But what the council is really looking for is they want service providers to take accountability, especially because in most cases, if a service provider is responsible for certain controls, not all of the controls, so that a merchant remains compliant, we don't want the service provider to fall down in that area because that means the merchant fails PCI compliance.
I think we might have maybe one more. This may be the last one, actually. New control requirement 12.11. In this change, we're looking to perform reviews at least quarterly to confirm personnel are following security policies and operational procedures. The reviews must cover the following processes: the daily log reviews, the firewall rule set reviews, applying configuration standards to the new systems, and responding to security alerts, as well as change management processes. This is a requirement change for service providers only. And by the way, one note on that, the larger organizations being service providers that serve a number of merchants, these present higher risk obviously anyway. So that's why you're seeing a lot of these being rolled out just at the service provider level now. I would not be surprised in the next revision of the data security standard that many of these may make their way down to the merchant level, just as an FYI. So continuing along here, we're talking about policies and procedures that need to be in place to address internal reviews, of employees following, the policies. So, for example, we need to make sure that not only have we made the changes to the policies, that we have implemented those to the rank and file throughout. Reviews have to be captured in writing to be used for the yearly external assessments. And the goal here is to ensure that the companies are not only in compliance during the yearly review, because the PCI Data Security Standard Report on Compliance Audit and the Self-Assessment Questionnaire are essentially point-in-time audits or assessments. And what this means is that this change here is to really enforce that a service provider in this case is compliant all year round, not just when the auditors show up and knock at the door, but rather they demonstrate each quarter that they've gone through and assessed themselves, and that's what qualified security assessors like Derek and myself would do with our clients as we go through. We look for evidence each quarter.
bearing in mind that this can tie back into the last about setting up a PCI charter and some governance. This should absolutely be something that's part of that role and responsibility, is who is going to conduct these quarterly assessments to make sure that policies and procedures and process are still being adhered to. And then the final little corollary to that is make sure that the review process you're doing is documented, and that someone is reviewing and signing off on those results who has the responsibility of the program, just as I was talking about. The reviews must be captured in writing, just like the last control, and the team must be tasked with PCI compliance internally, should be signing off on the reviews. Really, again, they've seen a gap in what merchants are responsible for PCI controls and what service providers are responsible for. In this case, they're looking at some of the, maybe not even the tier one they tout, we get a ROC every year and we go through and we do our controls and things like that. What they're looking for, in addition to the tier one vendors, is maybe some of the lower vendors that actually have these responsibilities, but they're either not aware or they may not be adhering to them on a regular basis, which in turn can hurt the merchant if there's a breach or there's a problem in some way. So doing this on a quarterly basis and just taking a look at the schemas and processes that you have in place is going to keep it kind of a much tighter overview than just having somebody come in for a yearly assessment.
So thank you guys, folks, for your time. We're going to open it up in a minute here for a question and answer session here. But these are a couple of the really good resources that I think when you get an opportunity to bounce out there. The PCI Security Standard Council site has a lot of great resources. This is where not only can you download the appropriate self-assessment questionnaire for your environment, as well as the report on compliance audit, the actual template that must be used for the testing. But also you'll see some great supplements. A supplement is really where PCI has gone through and documented different things like when new devices are coming out, or when there's a security threat that may have come in. There's one I think they put out on TLS with the threats, as well as recorded devices and things for when you record calls for security purposes and for quality assurance purposes. There's a supplement on that.
And then, as always, Compass keeps a compliance blog going with new posts, and just the website in general will have these webinars and a lot of information. Plus, on top of that, you can always contact Jerry or myself if you have any questions, especially about the January PCI requirements or anything else having to do with PCI for that matter.
So, Jeff, back to you, my friend. Any questions come in?
Yeah, great job, guys. Thank you guys so much for taking the time out to present this, and thanks to everybody, as Jerry and Derek already alluded to, for taking the time out of your day to jump on the webinar. We try and make these quick so they're not overburdening. So with that, we're going to open it up to some questions right now. If you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the chat box. We do have 3 questions that have come in. So Jerry, Derek, I don't know, I'll let you guys fight and argue over who wants to answer those. So we'll start with this one here, and this one came in from Michael Crowley. I'll read this here. Is the 6.4.4 requirement change that was briefed associated with 6.4.6?
The 6.4.4.
Yeah.
Not having the encyclopedia. Oh, you know what? Believe it or not, I believe that's a typo. That should be 6.4.6.
Oh.
That's actually. I believe it was in one of the earlier version of the slides. Yep. I apologize. You're absolute. Thank you very much. We will fix that.
For the sake of being accurate, Mr. Crowley, you're right on the money. They are related because they're the same. Apologize for the typo, and before we upload that, we'll make the modification.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep, we'll make that change and make sure, if you forward this to anybody, to make sure to have them listen to the end where we clear that up for anybody that might be confused. So thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. 2 more questions here, guys. Of all the changes that are going into effect on the 31st, which one is going to have the most impact or burden on a company?
So I'll take this one, Derek. Great question, by the way, whoever asked that one. But look, so there's a number of things, and really the answer depends a little bit on your environment. But in general, the one in Section 11, remember we mentioned that Section 11 is really the infrastructure scanning. It's your vulnerability assessing internally and externally, as well as the perimeter penetration testing externally, and also your segmentation internal segmentation pen testing. That those of you on the call that have had to sign off on statements of work and contracts for this work to be performed, you know that the penetration testing is not, it's not very cheap. It's a very, very deep dive, and it's where you take the vulnerabilities that are identified during a vulnerability scan and you move to actually exploit those. There are a number of expensive tools that are utilized, and the resources that run those tests are also well educated and maintain high-level certifications annually to be able to perform those. So that being said, my answer would be really that the penetration testing being required for semi-annual segmentation testing is going to probably have a little bit more burden on your pocketbook than some of the other items.
I agree with that from a pocketbook standpoint and a scheduling standpoint. I think my own personal answer is the multi-factor authentication internally, if you're not already prepared to have that rolled out, because I think there's going to be some internal changes to your environment to make that work accordingly. A lot of people are all set to do multi-factor outside of the organization, but if you have an internal cardholder data environment that's segmented off, you're going to have to change the way that you do things very, very quickly to get into those servers in those critical areas if you're an admin. So that would be my personal one.
Yeah, I wanted to note when you mentioned segmentation, Derek, that got me thinking too. So there was always a question way back when, and it's certainly prudent now, and that is, hey, what's the best tactic that you can do to reduce your risk and scope of PCI? And folks always often jump to segmentation. And while that is really one of, in fact, the second most critical thing that you can do to reduce your scope and cost, the most important consideration would be, do you even need to have the payment card information on your running across your network, things like that. The point is, payment card information, you're allowed to have the first 6 digits and the last 4, but everything in between must be left out. If that's the case, that's considered out of scope. So essentially, any system or any hard copy location where that first 6 and last 4 are the only digits shown, those are out of scope. So if you think about it, if I don't have a business reason or need to have the full PAN stored, don't store it. If you do it in a safe, compliant manner. But that's really the biggest consideration to reduce scope. The second is segmentation. Any other questions?
Awesome. Yeah, Jerry, we got one more here. And then, again, folks, if you have any other questions, feel free to pop them in that chat box now. So possibly the last question is, I thought we've been on PCI DSS version 3.2 for well over a year, and as far as I know, no new release has come out since, so where are these changes coming from?
These were all marked as best practices until February 1st of 2018, which means that if they were not in place, you were not penalized for not having them in place. We've actually had a couple of webinars on these, and in fact, when PCI 3.2 was first released, we had one that ran down all these requirements. This is a refresher because the requirements are coming live now, and the difference between a best practice and a true requirement means that failing a best practice means that we can say, hey, you got to get these in line by 2018. Failing a requirement means that, hey, we cannot issue that report on compliance as passing because the requirement has failed.
Yeah, and Derek, great point. And one other note worth mentioning as well, the PCI data security standard is a standard for the entire world. Think about that. Think about every business, every merchant, and every service provider in any industry, anywhere in the world, the same exact data security standard is being used. Now that's a daunting task of any document. And so the point is, they've got it on a 3-year cycle, and qualified security assessor companies like ours weigh in on some of the questions, some of the challenges, and help develop it and make it, sort of fine-tune it each year over the last. And so they've put the data security standard on a 3-year cycle. Now, if there's an emergency that comes out in the middle, you might get a point release like we did with TLS, when it was compromised a couple of years back. They came out with a point release that said, look, guys, TLS 1.0 has been compromised. And then 1.1 was, I think it was with Poodle. And the point is, they'll come out with point releases. But short of that, we're on a 3-year cycle. We got about another year. So sometime in late 2018, we expect to get a draft of the next data security standard. And I expect, again, to see the same approach. You folks, whoever asked that question, it was a great question. You're going to see, I'll expect a few items in there that aren't live yet, but, sort of coming soon, so you can financially position yourself, and likewise, from all aspects of your business, you can prepare for those changes before they become requirements.
Awesome.
Any more items?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, I think that covers everything. No more questions. Nobody's popped anything into the chat box. I think that we're good. So I'll go ahead and start to wrap this up. So first of all, Jerry, Derek, thank you both so much again for taking the time out to create the presentation, and then also obviously to present it to the folks that were able to join the call today. Thank you to everybody who was able to join today for taking time out of your schedule, especially with the pending holidays coming up. I know things are a little hectic wrapping up end of year, so I appreciate everybody taking the time. So we're going to say farewell for now and say farewell to 2017. So hope everybody has a happy, safe, and prosperous New Year and holiday season. And be sure to join us back in late January of 2018 for our 2018 webinar series kickoff, where we will be discussing incident response. So thank you, everybody. Happy holidays, and we look forward to seeing you again in a month or so. Take care. Thanks.
Take care, everybody.